The most powerful man in Rhode Island walked into my courtroom that Monday morning and told me he was going to end my career by sunset. By the time he left 18 minutes later, he understood that in America, even a governor bows to the law. His name was Governor Marcus Whitfield, 58 years old, three-term governor of Rhode Island. The man political analysts on every cable news network had been calling the next president of the United States. Tall, 6'3", silver hair combed back like he was about to step onto a debate stage, wearing a Brioni suit that cost more than most people in my courtroom made in 3 months. An American flag pin on his lapel, the kind politicians wear like a costume. And that practiced politician smile, the kind of smile that's been rehearsed in front of 1,000 mirrors and 1,000,000 cameras. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He looked at me from across my courtroom and he said it plainly, calmly, like he was ordering coffee. Judge Caprio, by Friday, you won't have a courtroom to come back to. I'll have your pension restructured. I'll have your son's law practice audited. And I'll have you removed from this bench within the week. So, let's not waste each other's time. You're going to dismiss this case. 40 years on this bench. 40 years. And I have never, not once, not from drug dealers, not from mob figures, not from corrupt cops, heard a threat as direct, as cold, and as confident as the one that came out of that governor's mouth that morning. It was a Monday in October, the kind of crisp New England day where the leaves on the maple trees outside the courthouse were turning that deep red color my wife, Joyce, always loved. Children walking to school in light jackets, the smell of wood smoke already drifting through the Providence neighborhoods. The kind of day where everything feels important, where everything feels like it matters. And it did. Because sitting in the front row of my gallery that morning, holding a folded American flag in a small canvas bag, was a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher named Eleanor Whitman. Eleanor was widowed. She walked with a cane. Her left hand had a tremor she tried to hide by keeping it pressed against her purse. She was wearing a navy blue cardigan that she'd probably owned for 20 years and a small gold cross around her neck. And when I looked at her, I saw fear. Real fear. The kind of fear you see in someone who has already lost almost everything and is one bad day away from losing the last thing they have left. What this governor did to her. What he tried to cover up. What happened in those 18 minutes when he thought he could intimidate a federal investigation inside my own courtroom. It's the reason I'm still wearing this robe today instead of being forced into retirement. It's the reason Eleanor Whitman still has a home. And it's a story I have never told publicly until right now. So, before I go any further, let me ask you something. If you believe that nobody is above the law in this country, not presidents, not governors, not the most powerful politicians in America, no matter how many campaign donations they collect or how many newspapers endorse them, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to tell you about Governor Marcus Whitfield, about Eleanor Whitman, about the federal agents who were quietly sitting in my gallery that morning, will restore your faith that justice in this country still works, that the system still functions, that when a powerful man tries to crush a small woman to build himself a fortune, there are still places in America where he can be stopped. This is the story of how a sitting governor walked into my courtroom thinking he owned the floor he was standing on, and walked out of it in handcuffs. The story didn't begin that Monday morning, of course. These things never do. By the time Governor Whitfield set foot in my courtroom, his lawyers had been pressuring Eleanor Whitman for 18 months. By the time he leaned over my bench and threatened my pension, the FBI had been building a case against him for over a year. By the time he said the words, "I am the system," out loud, in front of 40 witnesses, with 3 federal agents recording every syllable, his fate was already sealed. But he didn't know any of that yet. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was about to teach an old Italian judge from Federal Hill a lesson in real power. He was about to learn the opposite. Let me back up and tell you how this all started. Because to understand what happened in those 18 minutes, you have to understand what happened in the 18 months before. That morning, like every morning for the last 40 years, I was at my desk by 8:15 a.m. My father, Judge Caprio, came to this country from Italy with calloused hands and broken English, and he taught me one rule that I've never broken. "Frank," he'd say in that thick Italian accent of his, "if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late." 40 years on this bench, and I've never once walked into my courtroom unprepared. That's not pride. That's respect. Respect for the people who took the day off work to be there. Respect for the badge. Respect for the law itself. Christina, my clerk for 20 years now, brought me my coffee at exactly 8:20. Strong, black, the Italian way. Strong enough that the spoon practically stands up in the cup. She set it down on my desk and she gave me a look. Christina has been with me long enough that I can read her face like a newspaper. Something was wrong. "Judge," she said quietly, "you might want to take a closer look at the Whitman file before you go in there." I picked up the case file off the top of the docket and I felt the weight of it in my hand. Now, this case was listed on the docket as a routine property dispute. Eminent domain hearing. Should have been a thin folder. 20 pages, maybe 30. But the file Christina had put in front of me was almost 3 inches thick. 3 inches. For a property dispute over 1.2 acres on Bayview Road. That's when I knew something was very wrong. Let me tell you about Eleanor Whitman, because she's the heart of this story. Eleanor and her late husband Daniel bought their little house on Bayview Road in 1978. 47 years ago. They paid $34,000 for it back then, scraped together from his salary as a Providence police officer and her salary as a third-grade teacher at St. Mary's Elementary. They raised 3 children in that house, Daniel Jr., Margaret, and little Thomas. They planted a vegetable garden in the back. Daniel built a wooden swing for the kids with his own hands. Eleanor taught Sunday school in the dining room when the church basement flooded one winter. And then, 22 years ago, on a cold February night, Officer Daniel Whitman responded to a car accident on Route 6. A family of 4 had crashed into a guardrail, and the car had caught fire. Daniel pulled 2 children out of that burning vehicle. Twin girls, 6 years old. He went back in for the parents. He didn't come out. The fuel tank exploded, and Officer Daniel Whitman gave his life saving a family he had never met before that night. Eleanor was 49 years old when they handed her the folded flag. She never remarried. She raised those 3 children alone. She planted a memorial garden in the side yard where Daniel used to grow tomatoes. White roses, his favorite. And for 22 years, every single morning, Eleanor Whitman walked out into that garden with her coffee and she talked to her husband. That was the house. That was the property. That was the 1.2 acres that Governor Marcus Whitfield's Family Development Corporation, Whitfield Holdings, wanted to bulldoze for a $400 million luxury waterfront resort. The harassment started 18 months before that Monday morning. First, it was the offers. $180,000 for a property worth at least $600,000. Eleanor said no. Then it was $220,000. She said no again. Then men in suits started showing up at her door uninvited. Then phone calls at 11 at night. Then her insurance got mysteriously canceled. Then code violations started appearing on her property out of nowhere. A fence she'd had for 30 years was suddenly non-compliant. Her garden shed was suddenly in violation of setback requirements. A retaining wall her husband had built with his own hands in 1985 was suddenly an environmental hazard. And then, 6 weeks before she walked into my courtroom, the city of Providence, under direct pressure from the governor's office, filed for eminent domain. Public benefit, they called it. Eleanor was given 30 days to pack up 47 years of her life and get out. What I didn't know that morning, what almost nobody knew, was that the FBI had been quietly investigating Whitfield Holdings for 14 months. Corruption, bribery, abuse of office. They had a list of 47 other elderly property owners across Rhode Island who had been pressured the same exact way. Eleanor's case was the pattern they needed to bring the whole thing down. And by some miracle, by some God-given alignment of justice, Eleanor's case had landed on my docket. Christina leaned over my shoulder as I was reading the file, her voice barely above a whisper. "Judge, there's something else you should know. There are people in the courtroom today I've never seen before. Federal-looking people. 3 of them. They came in early, and they're sitting in different rows." I walked to the small window in my chambers and looked out into the gallery. Sure enough, I could see a woman in a charcoal gray suit sitting in the back row, scanning the room with the kind of trained patience you only get from years of federal work. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know she was Special Agent Rebecca Martinez of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. I just knew that whatever was about to walk into my courtroom was bigger than a property dispute. I scanned the rest of the gallery. 3 lawyers in $3,000 suits sitting at the plaintiff's table, briefcases lined up like soldiers. The governor's legal team. And at the defendant's table, sitting completely alone, was a young man who couldn't have been more than 26 years old. Cheap suit, nervous hands, a single manila folder in front of him. That was Attorney James Park, fresh out of law school. 6 months on the job, doing this case pro bono because no other lawyer in Rhode Island would touch it, and Eleanor Whitman, holding her folded flag, sitting in the front row, completely alone against the most powerful political machine in the state. I took one more sip of Christina's coffee, set the cup down, and I said a quiet prayer my mother taught me when I was a boy. Lord, give me the wisdom to see what's right, and the courage to do it. Then I walked into my courtroom. Court was called to order at 9:30 a.m. sharp. Christina stood up and said the words she said 10,000 times in 20 years. All rise for the Honorable Judge Frank Caprio. Everyone in the gallery stood. Eleanor Whitman stood, leaning hard on her cane. James Park, that young public defender, stood up so straight you'd have thought he was in the military. The three lawyers in their $3,000 suits stood up. The federal agents I didn't know about yet stood up. Even old Mrs. Patterson, who's been watching my court for 15 years, she stood up. You know who didn't stand up? Because he wasn't there. The governor was 5 minutes late. Deliberately late. The kind of late that's calculated to send a message. I'm more important than this court. My time matters more than your time. You will wait for me. He walked in at exactly 9:35, and he didn't walk in alone. 2 Rhode Island state troopers walked in ahead of him, in full uniform, sidearms visible. They positioned themselves at the back of the courtroom like he was a foreign dignitary needing protection from the citizens of his own state. That was intimidation, plain and simple. State troopers don't escort a governor to a municipal court hearing unless somebody wants to send a message about who's in charge. The governor strolled in behind them. Brioni suit, American flag pin, that politician smile. He didn't sit at the defendant's table where he was supposed to sit. He sat in the gallery, 3 rows back, crossed his legs, pulled out his phone, and started scrolling. His lead attorney stood up. Richard Sterling. Boston firm. $200 an hour. The kind of lawyer who walks into small municipal courts like ours and assumes the judge graduated from a community college. He had this thin smile on his face the whole time, like he was doing me a favor by being there. Your Honor, Sterling said, before we begin, I'd like to make a preliminary motion. This matter has effectively been resolved at the state level. The eminent domain authorization has been processed, the timelines have been established, and the governor's appearance today is, frankly, a courtesy. We'd respectfully request the court accept the state's determination and dismiss this hearing as redundant. I looked at Sterling. Then I looked past Sterling at Governor Whitfield, who was still on his phone in the 3rd row, his thumb scrolling away like he was at the airport waiting for a flight. Counselor, I said, in my courtroom, the only courtesy is the law. And the law says when a 71-year-old widow is about to be removed from her home of 47 years, she gets a hearing, a real one. Now you can tell the governor he can put his phone away and approach the bench. This is not a press event. This is not a board meeting. This is a court of law, and he will conduct himself accordingly. Sterling turned around slowly. The governor finished whatever he was typing, slid the phone into his pocket without any hurry, stood up, and walked to the defendant's table. He never once looked at me. Not when he was walking. Not when he sat down. He looked at his Rolex. Mrs. Whitman, I said, please come forward and tell the court your side of this matter. Eleanor stood up slowly. Her cane shook a little against the wooden floor of the gallery. She walked the 15 feet from her seat to the front of the courtroom like it was 15 miles. She was 71 years old, but in that moment she looked 91. She was carrying that small canvas bag with her, the one with the folded flag inside, clutching it against her chest like a child holds a stuffed animal. She stood at the witness stand. Her voice was shaky at first, but it got stronger as she went. Your Honor, she said, my name is Eleanor Whitman. My husband, Daniel, and I bought our home on Bayview Road on June 14, 1978. We paid $34,000 for it. I remember because Daniel cried when we signed the papers. He'd grown up in a one-room apartment over a bakery, and that was the first home he ever owned. She took a breath. We raised 3 children in that house, Your Honor. Daniel Jr. is a high school teacher in Massachusetts now. Margaret is a nurse in Connecticut. Thomas, our youngest, is in the Navy. They all came home to that house every Christmas for 22 years. She paused, and her hand was trembling on the cane. I could see her trying to control it. 2 years ago, this February, my husband responded to a car crash on Route 6. A family was trapped in a burning vehicle. Daniel pulled 2 little girls out of that car. 6-year-old twins. Their names were Sarah and Rebecca Coleman. He went back in for their parents. The fuel tank exploded, Your Honor. My husband died saving a family he'd never met. She reached into her canvas bag, and with both hands she lifted out a folded American flag. The triangle. The one they hand to the widow at the funeral. She held it up so the court could see it. They gave me this flag on February 12, 2003. I've kept it on the mantelpiece in our living room for 22 years, right above the spot where Daniel used to hang his hat when he came home from his shift. I planted a memorial garden in the side yard where he used to grow tomatoes. White roses, his favorite. And every morning, for the last 22 years, I have walked into that garden with my coffee, and I have talked to my husband. Her voice broke just slightly. Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to stay in the home where I can still feel my Daniel's presence. That's all I have left of him. That's all I'm asking. The courtroom was completely silent. I saw old Mrs. Patterson dab at her eyes with a tissue. I saw James Park, that young public defender, looking down at his hands trying not to cry himself. And then I heard it. A laugh. Governor Marcus Whitfield, sitting at the defendant's table. He actually laughed out loud. Not a small laugh. A real one. The kind of laugh you let out when you find something genuinely amusing. Then he leaned forward and addressed the court without being recognized. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is exactly the emotional manipulation our team predicted. Mrs. Whitman is a sympathetic figure, certainly, and her late husband's service is commendable. But this is precisely how property law gets perverted in this country. Mrs. Whitman is welcome to take her flag and her memories and move into one of the very nice senior living facilities that my family's foundation generously supports. We'll even cover the relocation costs. Progress doesn't stop for nostalgia, Your Honor. We can't freeze 1.2 acres of prime waterfront because a woman wants to talk to her dead husband in a garden. I felt my blood pressure climb. I felt it in my chest, in my temples, in the back of my neck. 40 years on this bench, and I have heard cruelty before. I have heard cruelty wearing a badge. I have heard cruelty wearing a designer suit. I have heard cruelty with a trust fund and cruelty with a rap sheet. But this was something different. This was cruelty wearing a state seal. Cruelty pretending to be public service. I heard an audible gasp from the gallery. Multiple gasps. A young woman in the third row, couldn't have been more than 25, actually said the words, "Oh my God," out loud. I should have reprimanded her. I should have called for order. I didn't. Because she was speaking for every decent person in that room. Eleanor was still standing at the witness stand. Her hands were trembling badly now. The flag was shaking in her grip. She didn't say a word. She just looked down at the floor. I let the silence hang in that courtroom for a long moment. I wanted Eleanor to be able to walk back to her seat. I wanted Whitfield to hear how loud the silence was. Sometimes silence is the most damning sound in a courtroom. When Eleanor was seated again, I turned my full attention to the governor. "Governor Whitfield," I said, keeping my voice level. "Are you aware that Mrs. Whitman's property is the only parcel of land standing between your family's development corporation and a $400 million luxury waterfront resort?" Whitfield's smile widened. He thought he was winning. He thought I'd just opened the door for him to make his case. "Judge Caprio," he said, leaning back in his chair like we were having drinks at a country club. "I'm aware that I've personally created more jobs in this state than any governor in 30 years. I'm aware that I've raised the standard of living for hundreds of thousands of Rhode Islanders. I'm aware that the proposed development on Bayview Road would generate 800 construction jobs, 400 permanent hospitality positions, and approximately $22 million annually in state tax revenue. I'm also aware that one stubborn old woman is holding up $400 million in investment that would change the economic future of this entire region. So yes, Judge, I'm aware of the situation. The question is, are you?" And then he did the move. The move every villain in every one of these cases does eventually. He turned his back to me, to the bench, and he turned to face the gallery. "How many of you here today," he said, raising his voice, "have a job because of my administration? How many of you here today have health care for your families because of policies I signed into law? How many of you here today sleep safer at night because of the law enforcement budgets I personally increased? Look around this courtroom. The roads you drove on this morning. The schools your grandchildren attend. The hospitals you've been treated in. I built those. Me. I let him get that far. I let him hear his own voice echoing off the wooden walls of my courtroom. Because sometimes a man needs to hear himself talk in order to understand what he's saying. Then I picked up my gavel. Bang. "Governor Whitfield," I said, and my voice cut through that courtroom like a steel blade. "This is not a campaign rally. This is not a town hall. This is not a press conference. This is a court of law. You will face the bench. You will address the bench. And you will not turn this proceeding into theater. Am I understood?" He turned back to face me slowly. The smile was gone. What was left in its place was something I'd been waiting to see. The cold politician's stare. The mask underneath the mask. The man behind the smile. "Judge," he said, and his voice was different now. Quieter, more clinical. "Let me speak plainly. I've been governor of this state for 11 years. I'll be governor for at least 3 more years, and after that I'll be sitting in a different chair in a different city wearing a different title. I have personally appointed half the judges currently sitting on the bench in Rhode Island. The other half owe me political favors in one form or another. And you, Judge, you're an elected municipal judge in a city where my endorsement decides elections." He let that sit in the air. "Now, I've always respected you, Frank. I really have. The whole state respects you. You're a legend in Rhode Island. But you and I both know that legends are made of paper. And paper burns." He took a step closer to my bench, then another. He stopped about 6 feet from where I was sitting. State troopers in the back of the room. His lawyers frozen at the table. Eleanor staring at her hands in the front row. "Judge Caprio," he said, and now his voice was almost gentle. "The gentle voice is the most dangerous voice a powerful man can use. Legends retire. That's the natural order of things. But legends who make the wrong enemies, they retire faster than they planned. Sometimes they retire without their pensions. Sometimes their reputations get a little tarnished on the way out. Sometimes things get complicated." The courtroom was dead silent. Christina had stopped typing. I could hear her hands hovering over the keys, frozen. I could hear Eleanor breathing in the front row. "I signed legislation just last month," Whitfield continued, "restructuring municipal court districts in this state. It was a small provision, buried inside a much larger budget bill. Nobody read it carefully. But what it did, Frank, what it did was give the state Senate president the authority to merge underperforming municipal courts into consolidated districts. With one phone call to the state Senate president, who is incidentally my wife's brother, I can have your courtroom merged out of existence by Christmas. Your courthouse becomes a regional satellite office. Your bench becomes a memory. Your 40 years of service become a footnote in somebody else's history book." He lowered his voice now, but in the dead silence of that courtroom, every single person in the gallery heard every single word. "Your pension, Judge, after 40 years. That gets reviewed. Your reputation, that gets discussed in the right newspapers. Your son, Michael's law practice. Funny how many state contracts pass through Caprio Associates. I'd hate to see those contracts come up for rebidding under unfavorable circumstances. Your daughter-in-law, Sarah, isn't she a public school teacher? Tenure decisions are state-funded, Judge. All of these things, every single one of them, they exist because the system allows them to exist." And then he said it. The line I will never forget for the rest of my life. "I am the system, Frank." He let it hang there. He wanted me to feel it. He wanted Eleanor to feel it. He wanted the whole courtroom to understand that the man standing in front of them wasn't a defendant. He was an emperor, so here's what's going to happen, Judge. You're going to dismiss this case as without merit. You're going to recommend that Mrs. Whitman accept the very generous final offer my foundation has put forward. $260,000 and a beautifully appointed unit in a senior community of her choosing. She gets to spend her remaining years comfortable. You get to keep your courtroom. Your son keeps his practice. Your daughter-in-law keeps her tenure. And we all walk out of here today with our futures intact." He paused. "Or, and I say this with genuine sadness, Frank, because I do respect you, by Friday afternoon you will not have a courtroom to come back to on Monday morning. The choice is yours, and it's a very simple choice." Then he did something I will remember until the day I die. He winked at me. He actually winked. In open court. In front of 40 witnesses. The most powerful man in Rhode Island looked a sitting judge in the eye and winked, like we were partners in a card game and he'd just slipped me the winning hand under the table. I took off my glasses. I rarely do that. Christina knows what it means. The lawyers who practice in my court know what it means. When Judge Caprio takes off his glasses, something is about to happen. I cleaned them slowly with the small cloth I keep in my robe pocket. I took my time. The whole courtroom was watching me. The governor was watching me with that confident half-smile. The one that said he's going to fold, they all fold eventually. While I cleaned my glasses, I thought about my father. I thought about Giuseppe Caprio, who came to this country with nothing in his pockets but hope. who worked construction during the day, security at night, and weekend shifts on the docks, who once turned down a $200 bribe from a job site foreman that would have fed our family for a month and walked home in the rain to tell my mother why we'd be eating beans. I could hear his voice as clearly as if he was sitting next to me on the bench. Frank, when a powerful man tries to scare you, that's the moment you find out who you really are. Don't waste that moment. I thought about Officer Daniel Whitman, who 22 years ago ran into a burning car not once, but twice, who pulled 2 little girls out of the flames, who didn't make it back out, who left behind a widow who was now sitting 6 feet in front of me, holding the flag they handed her at his funeral. I thought about every single person who had walked into my courtroom, over 40 years believing that the system would treat them fairly. Single mothers crying over $25 parking tickets. Young veterans trying to get their lives back together. Elderly couples on fixed incomes. Working people. Honest people. People who had nothing in this world except the faith that when they stood in front of a judge, the judge would see them as human beings. I put my glasses back on, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 40 years on this bench. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was deeper than both. It was a kind of clarity, the kind of clarity that comes once or twice in a lifetime, when you know exactly who you are and exactly what you have to do. I looked Governor Marcus Whitfield in the eye, and I started to speak. Before I tell you what I said next, I have to tell you about a night in 1955. I was 12 years old. My father, Judge Caprio, was working construction on a 5-story building going up off Atwells Avenue. He was a foreman by then. Italian immigrant who couldn't read English when he stepped off the boat, but he could read a blueprint better than any college-educated engineer on that site. The men respected him. He earned every ounce of that respect with his hands. That afternoon, I was sitting on a stack of cinder blocks waiting for him to finish his shift so we could walk home together. And I saw it happen. I saw the site supervisor, a heavy-set man in a brown suit, walk up to my father and slip an envelope into his shirt pocket. I saw my father stop working. I saw him pull the envelope out, open it, look inside. There was $200 cash in that envelope. In 1955, that was almost a month's pay. The supervisor leaned in and said something quiet. I couldn't hear it from where I was sitting. But years later, my father told me what he said. They were using substandard rebar in the support columns. Cheap steel that wouldn't hold under load. The kind of corner cutting that brings buildings down on the heads of the men working inside them. The supervisor wanted my father to sign off on the inspection paperwork and look the other way. I watched my father hand the envelope back. I watched him take off his hard hat. I watched him walk to the foreman's trailer, set his hat and his tools down on the desk, and walk off that job site for the last time. It was raining when we walked home. My father didn't say a word the whole way. When we got to our apartment, my mother was at the stove. She turned around to greet him, and she saw his face. She saw he was carrying his lunch pail instead of leaving it at the site. She knew immediately what had happened. "Maria," he said quietly in Italian, "we'll be eating beans for a while." My mother didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just nodded once and turned back to the stove. That night, after my brothers and sisters had gone to bed, my father sat me down at the kitchen table. His hands were still raw from the day's work, knuckles cracked from the cold. He put one of those big, calloused hands on top of mine, and he looked me dead in the eye. "Frank," he said, "a man with no integrity has nothing. A man with integrity has everything, even when he has nothing. You remember this. Money comes and money goes. Reputations come and reputations go. But who you are when nobody's watching, that's the only thing in this whole world that belongs to you. Nobody can take it from you. Only you can give it away." He squeezed my hand. "Power tries to buy you, Frank, because it knows that's the only way to defeat you. The day you become a man who cannot be bought is the day you become untouchable in the only way that matters." 3 weeks later, a section of that building collapsed during construction. 2 workers were killed. The investigation found exactly what my father had refused to sign off on. The supervisor went to prison. My father took a pay cut at his next job, and we ate beans and pasta with no meat for almost 2 months. But he slept through the night, every single night. I was 12 years old when I learned what real power looks like. It doesn't wear a suit. It doesn't sit behind a desk. It doesn't have a title. It sits at a kitchen table with raw hands and an empty wallet, looking its son in the eye and telling him the truth. That was the man Governor Marcus Whitfield had just tried to bribe through me. He didn't know it. He didn't know that when he winked at me from across my courtroom. He wasn't winking at Judge Frank Caprio, he was winking at Giuseppe Caprio's son, and Giuseppe Caprio's son was about to remind him exactly what that meant. Want to flag something before I write this. You asked for 250 words, but the outline you pasted contains 5 full beats including the verbal demolition, the ruling, the FBI twist reveal, and the arrest. That's genuinely impossible to do justice to in 250 words. Each beat alone needs 150 words to land emotionally. Compressing all 5 into 250 words total would kill the viral payoff. This section is the dopamine hit the entire 4,000-word buildup exists for. My recommendation. Let me write section 5 in 800 words, matching your original 800 words per section structure from your first instruction. This section is the climax. It needs the same weight as the other sections, not less. If you genuinely want 200 to 250 words, I can do it. But it'll be a stripped-down summary that loses the cinematic feel of the competitor scripts you analyzed. Tell me which you prefer. 6 months passed. Governor Marcus Whitfield resigned within 48 hours of his arrest. He didn't have a choice. By Tuesday afternoon, the lieutenant governor was being sworn in, and by Wednesday morning, Whitfield was on the front page of every newspaper from Boston to New York. The federal indictment came down 2 weeks later. 23 counts: obstruction of justice, bribery, wire fraud, abuse of office, conspiracy, tax evasion. The full menu. His expensive lawyers fought hard for about a month, and then they did what expensive lawyers do when the evidence is overwhelming. They negotiated a plea deal. 9 years in federal prison. No early release. No country club facility. He's serving his sentence in a medium-security federal institution in Pennsylvania. The FBI investigation didn't stop with him either. It expanded. 6 other state officials were indicted as part of the corruption network Whitfield had built over 11 years. The state Senate president, his brother-in-law, the one who was supposed to merge my courtroom out of existence by Christmas, he's now serving 4 years for racketeering. 3 state legislators, a city zoning commissioner, and the head of the state housing authority all went down with him. They called it the largest public corruption case in Rhode Island history. But the part that mattered most happened on a quiet Saturday morning in May. On a little 1.2-acre property on Bayview Road, Eleanor Whitman invited me to a small ceremony at her home. Her 3 children were there. Daniel Jr. flew in from Massachusetts. Margaret drove down from Connecticut. Thomas had been granted leave from the Navy. There were maybe 30 people total. A few neighbors. A couple of officers from the Providence PD who had served with her late husband. The chief of police himself was there in dress uniform. We gathered in the front yard, by the memorial garden Eleanor had planted 22 years ago. The white roses were in full bloom, and there, mounted beside the front door, was a bronze plaque. The chief of police read it out loud. The Officer Daniel Whitman Memorial Home, established 1978, protected in perpetuity by the state of Rhode Island in honor of Officer Daniel Whitman, who gave his life on February 12, 2003, saving Sarah and Rebecca Coleman, age 6, from a burning vehicle. He has the heart of a hero and the soul of a servant. His home shall stand. The Coleman twins were there. They're 28 years old now, both school teachers. They each placed a single white rose at the base of the plaque. Eleanor used part of her $250,000 in damages to start the Daniel Whitman Foundation. Within 6 months, that foundation provided free legal aid to 34 elderly homeowners across Rhode Island who were being pressured by developers using the same playbook Whitfield Holdings had used. 34 families who got to keep their homes because Eleanor Whitman refused to give up hers. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in late June, a letter arrived at my chambers. Plain, white envelope. Federal prison return address, handwritten. I sat down at my desk and I opened it. Judge Caprio. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I know you wouldn't grant it cheaply if I did. But I want you to know something. In here, with nothing to distract me, I think about Mrs. Whitman every single day. I think about that flag in her bag. I think about my own father, a postal worker in Cranston who walked the same route for 34 years and who taught me to be better than I became. Somewhere in the last 11 years, Judge, I forgot who I was. I told myself I was building something. The truth is, I was destroying everything that mattered. My wife has left me. My children won't speak to me. My oldest son told me he was ashamed to share my last name, and I deserve all of it. I'm writing because I want you to know. I plan to spend the rest of my life, however long that is, trying to undo even a small fraction of the harm I have caused. Thank you, Judge, for not letting me get away with it. Thank you for saving me from the man I was becoming. Yours in regret, Marcus. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. 2 days later, Eleanor came by my chambers to drop off some paperwork for the foundation. I asked her to sit down. I handed her the letter. She read it slowly. When she was finished, she folded it carefully and set it down on my desk. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. Judge, my Daniel used to say that the strongest people in this world aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up and try to do better. I hope he finds his way. That's Eleanor Whitman. That's the woman Marcus Whitfield called one stubborn old woman. I still think about that Monday morning sometimes. The leaves turning red outside the courthouse. Eleanor Whitman sitting in the front row with that folded flag pressed against her chest. The most powerful man in Rhode Island standing 6 feet from my bench telling me he was the system. And you know what? In that moment, Governor Whitfield was telling me the truth as he understood it. He had become so used to power, so insulated by people who told him yes for 11 years, that he genuinely believed he and the system were the same thing. But that's not how it works in America. That's never how it has worked in America. In America, the system is bigger than any one person. It's bigger than any governor, any senator, any president, any billionaire. The system is the Constitution. The system is the law. The system is every ordinary person who walks into a courtroom believing they're going to be treated fairly. And it's every judge, every clerk, every public servant who makes sure that they are. Eleanor Whitman walked into my courtroom that morning with nothing but a cane, a folded flag, and the truth. And the truth, in the end, turned out to be more powerful than $400 million dollars, 3 of the most expensive lawyers in New England, and an 11-year political machine. My father used to say, "Frank, the law is the only weapon a small man has against a big one. Never let anyone take it away from him." That's exactly what was almost taken from Eleanor Whitman that day. And that's exactly what we stood up to protect. I'm Frank Caprio. Remember, in this country, no man, no matter how powerful, is above the law. And no woman, no matter how small the world makes her feel, is beneath its protection. Thanks for listening, and God bless.